my mother get drugged across the lawn from trying to call the police, being pulled by her ankles to our home. I watched this little girl looking out of the window at that, and I said I would never marry a man that would do this to me. Well, I did. I married him, and a part of the deal, as you would call it, was he didn't have children, and he wanted a child of his own. Once we were married, 2018 December, he came to me and he said, I'll take care of you. You finish school, you get your degree, and I'll take care of the home. That was my first red flag. Before him, I had my own home, my own career, my independence, my self-esteem. I didn't even recognize who I had become when I married him. My second red flag, he would come home and complain about a fork being in the sink. It scared me so much that we would argue about something as simple as a fork. It was never about the fork. It was about control. My anxiety began very early because that is when I would rush before I knew he would come home to make sure the kitchen was clean, make sure everything was perfect, make sure everything was in order, out of fear. Your body tells a story. We have to start listening to our bodies. I began to get hives. I don't know how to this day, other than God, that I managed to make it as a full-time student, a full-time mother, full-time wife, making the honor roll at Georgia Southern. I would throw up before each test. I thought it was test anxiety. We would argue before each test because he was even wanting to strip me of my degree. Before I recognized the signs of abuse, I realized that I went into a depression, couldn't figure out why, couldn't put my hands on it. Every argument that we had would lead to him walking out. I would like to educate a couple of you. If you don't know, domestic violence is not always with your fist. It is with your mind first. Mine was financial, mine was emotional, mine was isolation. The final straw was him hitting me. We're from Savannah, Georgia, and I remember thinking, I need to get out of this. I remember thinking, let me get away, so I would leave the home, go to family members' homes, and contemplate in my mind, how do I get out? He's taken all of my resources, down to my vehicle that was paid for. It happened very quickly, where he isolated me and moved me to Charlotte, North Carolina within a week. I had no time to tell my family goodbye. I had no time to even process what was happening. In my mind, I thought new opportunity, new change, new everything. It didn't work out that way. When we moved to Charlotte, he would leave us for days at a time. I had already given birth to our daughter, and during her birth, I can't forget to mention a really big red flag. When I did a gender reveal, and everyone was at the kitchen table, and everyone had to bite out of a cupcake. And inside of the cupcake was pink. Everyone had a reaction except for him. There was no reaction. My kids were overjoyed. I was excited just to see how happy he would be that he's having a baby girl. There was no reaction. I'll continue to say that as we comfortably got settled in North Carolina, the mask came off. He left me isolated. He left me alone. Every argument, like I said, would lead to him walking out. You see, he had already entered into my mind that I wasn't good enough. He had already accessed my self-esteem, or I felt that I wasn't pretty enough. I'm not a Beyonce or nothing, y'all, but I'm saying he had me feeling like I was the ugliest thing on this planet. With that being said, because time is very limited, he ended up getting physical. We had a disagreement, and we were evicted because by this point, I had no idea where the money was going. I had no idea about anything that was happening around me, because by the time we moved here, I was in survival mode. I didn't know why. I couldn't put my finger on it, but in my gut, I knew something wasn't right. My mother kept visiting me in dreams, and I began to pray, and I began to fast, and I said, God, you're going to have to show me out loud. You're going to have to yell it from the mountaintops, because I'm not getting out of this marriage unless you tell me. Be careful what you pray for. Because out of the blue, I was attempting to build a organization to help single moms get through dealing with a nonprofit, dealing with special needs kids. One friend led me to another and connected me with this lady in Jacksonville, Florida. Again, I was praying and I was fasting, and I decided to detach from the marriage so I can focus a little more on my mental health. Because my thought process was, if I'm gonna get out of this, let me at least make sure that it's not me. And so I checked into therapy, I began exercising, just spending time away mentally and emotionally, focusing more on the girls, and making sure that my mental is healthy. Well, again I say, I let him know that if at the end of this journey, God tells me that I have to exit, I am going to have the courage to leave you. That phone call from Jacksonville happened to be a pastor. I'd never met her, she never met me, and she woke me up after I told her my story about my son. She woke me up in the middle of the night, and she said, I made a vow to God that if he ever showed this to me again, I would never keep it. I would have to share what God put in my spirit. And I was like, okay, what are you talking about? She said to me, you're in danger, and you're gonna die. She told me a story about 2 or 3 weeks prior, before us meeting, that she had to bury one of her church members because she didn't reach out fast enough, because he shot her in the head and he killed her. She told me that I have to get out, and get out immediately. I didn't know what to do. While I was still in school, believe it or not, became fully online, still a full-time student, still a full-time mom. I don't know how I did it, but I managed to keep my grades up with A's and B's while being in an abusive marriage. I confronted him one day because we had become evicted and we lost a new home that we were applying for. And I said, we have to talk about this. I stood in front of a door, not understanding what I was doing. But by this point, I was so desperate to get him just not to walk out that I sat Indian style on the floor in our bedroom, thinking this would help him not walk out. I stood up, and that is when he open-handedly slapped me in my left ear, knocking me on the floor. The adrenaline was so high that I didn't process what had just happened. My self-esteem was so low that I just wanted him to stay and not walk out. He continued that day to knock me on the floor. My ear was ringing, and I didn't even recognize that I had just been hit. After that, I called the police, and they told me where to meet them the next day because I was too afraid to do it the day of. They left me in the parking lot for 2.5 hours. The police never showed up. I went back home, and around 10:30, the police called, but by that point, I was too afraid to tell, too afraid to leave. So I stayed. And I blamed myself. And I said, maybe if I wouldn't have aggravated him, maybe if I wouldn't have talked about it, maybe if I wouldn't have stood in front of the door, I just blamed myself. After that, maybe a month, me and my daughter at the time was 12, we went to the store. Again, our gut as women. I didn't feel comfortable leaving him alone with our daughter. Simply because I knew that there was a temper, that it's difficult for him to parent because he came from a place of abuse. I went to the store with my daughter and I received a phone call from him, and he said there's been an accident. He's obsessed with technology, so he had cameras everywhere, including listening devices. I rushed home and was shocked to see there was blood everywhere. Bloody gauze. Her bears had blood, sheets, blankets, you name it. It was just a bloodbath. I knew in my spirit I couldn't react like I wanted because it could put both of us in danger. And so I grabbed my daughter and looked at her mouth, and there was a huge gash in her upper gum, blood everywhere. I said, we gotta take her to the hospital. We get to the hospital. I asked him to stay in the car. Being an educator of 15 years, I know the system, I know how it can look. I didn't have any idea how I would handle it in the hospital, but I still defended him. And I said, stay in the car because I don't know where this can go. That night, he stormed out of the car, almost breaking the car window, and faded away. At that moment, I felt a sigh of relief, like, finally, my daughter can tell me what happened to her. Well, we get into the hospital, and he shows up. My daughter asked me to go to the restroom, and I said, can you tell mommy what happened? She said, Daddy did it. He bashed her head into her bed, and he beat her with some type of object. I tried to find camera footage, but he deleted it immediately that night. About a month after that, I had to make the courageous decision to run and not look back. I made a decision to call the domestic violence shelter, and I did just that. I left with no money, no resources, no car, nothing. I left with the clothes on my back, and I heard God say to me, I will protect you. Everything that you've lost, I will give it to you ×3. The blessing is, since I've left him, he took everything. We were homeless. I had no family. I had no friends. And when I did try to contact my family, I wasn't believed because he was a church musician. I made a decision to leave and not look back. Unbeknown to me, that my battle had just begun. See, when you leave an abuser and you have a child with them, the power and control doesn't go away. The the new side of abuse, because this wasn't a thing when I was growing up in the 80s. Now, abusers use the courts, they use their children as collateral damage. I have been in a 4-year-long custody battle. I have been jailed. I have contempts filed after contempt. And I know that we are in a state of emergency. I'll tell you why. There is absolutely no reason for a judge, a police, a detective, an advocate to not believe a woman when she says she's afraid. There is no reason for a judge, police, an advocate to not believe a little girl that says, I am afraid to go with my daddy. We're not believed. I would like to take a few moments out to read a brief story. I'm not going to read all of it, because I think it's very important to make it known that if we don't shake it up, and if we don't take domestic violence seriously through the courts, through these children, we're either going to die or we're going to grow up with a generation full of young girls that are so traumatized that they will never overcome the abuse. I would like to read a story to you about a girl named Kaden. Briefly. To most of her family and friends, Kaden was a typical 7-year-old. She was a talented athlete and a good student who loved dancing and singing around the house. Reminds me of my 7-year-old. And even competed in local pageants. Everyone thinks that their kid's the most amazing person on the planet. But this little girl was different. She was special. Kaden's mom, Kathy, told ABC News everyone wanted to be her best friend. But on August 6th, Kaden's vibrant life was cut short in a flash. You see, Kaden's biological father, Jeffrey, killed the young girl inside of his Philadelphia home before taking his own life following a years-long, bitter custody battle with their mother. She quoted and said, "I still don't feel like it's real. I still feel like I'm going to wake up from this awful nightmare. But I know that I'm not." 1 month after their daughter's death, Kathy and Kaden's stepfather, Brian, are opening up to Nightline in their first television interview about their unimaginable loss. They believe this tragedy could have been avoided if it weren't for the family court system that they say failed them. They hope sharing their story will shed light on mental health and family custody issues. My daughter and several other stories that I don't have time to read, but we're in a state of emergency. There are children dying. There are women dying behind a systemic court problem where women are not believed, children are not heard, and they're forced to go with the abuser. I am that story. And so I ask each of you to say a prayer for my daughter while I'm battling, trying to keep her safe. But I will tell you this, there is not one demon in hell that is going to stop me from protecting her, for standing up, not just for her, but for all of the little girls and the women that have lost their life, lost their children, lost their sanity, and even been jailed, because I too went to jail behind this, for having my daughter in the hospital. Because before visits, she would get sick and throw up. After visits, she would also feel nauseous and vomit. Your body tells a story. My message today is to educate each and every one of you about the unseen domestic violence that you can't see with the hidden eye. You see, there are abusers that can't let go, and so there are abusers that use technology. There's tracking devices in my vehicle. I've had my medical records hacked into, my social media hacked into. I've been followed, driven off of the sides of the road. I live in the courthouse now, which is how I have the courage to stand here and tell you we have a systemic problem. I recently discovered that it's $1 million industry because sending the child to the abuser means we're going to end up back in court. These advocates get paid outrageous amounts of money to do what they're supposed to do, which is protect the child. And most cases aren't difficult. Just look at the paper trail. Look at the documents. We run, we left. It's quite obvious. I had the courage to get out with no regrets. My life has started over, and I will spend the rest of my life fighting for women and children. We have to pass laws. We need to change bills. We have to start over again. Our system, our court system, is extremely corrupt. I've been in the court system several times where I've showed evidence of my bruises, where I've showed evidence of being tracked and followed, harassed. By the way, he has not said one word to me since I've left him, nor does he communicate with his daughter. But he goes to court probably every week begging for full custody of her to hurt me. Let it sink in. There are children that are having nightmares, that have to go to an abuser's home. And when my little girl would come home, Mommy, I was with a babysitter. So I'm being drugged to court when you don't even spend time with our daughter. I would like to end this with a poem. It is so important, you guys, that we vote, that we pay attention to who we elect, the judges we put on the bench, the advocates that we sign up for, children's rights, council rights. It is so important that we open our eyes and we pay attention, because you can't see my bruises. I have PTSD. I live every single day in fear, wondering when he will snap, when a judge is going to decide to make her go with him. Right now, I have an extremely resilient little girl that said, I'm not getting out of the car anymore. She's her mother's child. I'm going to read a poem to you before leaving. Thank you. Give me 1 second. I was afraid of being rejected until I learned to never reject myself. I was afraid of being abandoned until I learned to never abandon myself. I was afraid of the opinion of others until I learned that they held no more weight than my own. I was afraid of painful endings until I realized that they were also new beginnings. I was afraid of appearing weak until I realized how strong I truly was. I was afraid of being seen as small and unimportant until I discovered my true power and potential. I was afraid of being perceived as ugly until I learned to fully appreciate my own beauty. I was afraid of failure until I learned that it was an illusion when viewed through the eyes of love, growth, and learning. I was afraid of feeling low until I learned that it was the birthplace of brilliance and where my greatest transformation occurred. I was afraid of change until I realized it was an inevitable part of life. in a world full of things temporary and fleeting. I was afraid of being alone until I learned to fully embrace and appreciate my own company. I was afraid of my uniqueness until I learned that it was where my greatness lay. I was afraid of the darkness until I remembered that I was the light. And I was afraid of life until I remembered who I was. Talia Hunter, don't ever forget who you are and whose you are. You're going to see my face. You're going to hear my voice. I will not rest. I will not allow one more systemic thing to disrupt the peace of my daughter and any other children that have died in domestic violence. It's an easy fix. We have to come together as a nation, not just North Carolina, because I'm speaking to people in Canada, Russia, London. This is a systemic, worldwide problem. Children are dying unnecessarily. I want to thank each and every one of you.